хочу вкратце рассказать о нашем госте. Дэниел Столджар, или по-другому можно его назвать Нонстандard, потому что на самом деле его корни уходят, узнали, что на самом деле из Одессы начально, вот, поэтому Дэниел Столджар на самом деле представитель замечательной философии австралийской. То есть он продолжает традиции австралийской философии. Какое-то время назад он являлся президентом Ассоциации австралийских философов. Сейчас возглавляет, вот, похожий на нас отчасти, Центр исследования сознания. Дэниел также является редактором Стэнфордской энциклопедии философии, где он отвечает за направление philosophy of mind. Дэниел замечательный философ, он пишет каждый раз книги, которые прямо целую главу философии открывают. Он берет очень трудные темы и умудряется в них сделать значимый прогресс. Например, он написал книгу по физикализму. Казалось бы, физикализм — это такая распространенная позиция философии. Значит, большинство философов, наверное, считают себя физикалистами. Вот. И Дэниел берет, казалось бы, всем совсем ясную тему, позицию, которую как бы все разделяют, и, значит, открывает в ней массу лакун, массу проблем. И, в общем, в связи с именно его работой приходится по-новому посмотреть на самую распространенную философию, современной философии, аналитической философии, позицию. Потом он берет другую тему, например, проблему прогресса философии, и доказывает то, что многие ученые и даже философы отрицают, а именно наличие возможности решения философских проблем и наличие прогресса в дисциплине. Ну и, конечно же, Дэниел работает с одной из центральных проблем философии, это проблемы сознания. И, насколько я понимаю, сегодня он фокусируется именно на этой теме и нам расскажет свою интересную позицию. Эта позиция немножко напоминает мистерианизм, но мистерианизмом не является. Он, наверное, сейчас нам прояснит разницу в своем подходе и подходе, скажем, таких философов, как Магин или Наги. И я хочу действительно поблагодарить, это явно не только мое начинание, во-первых, это начинание наше, мы только что говорили с Вадимом Валерьевичем Васильевым, приблизительно 9 лет назад пришла идея создать этот центр, частью которой является организация вот таких вот поездок. И, собственно, Вадим Валерьевич привел меня в эту профессию и заинтересовал меня философией сознания. Я крайне ему благодарен за этот замечательный дар. Вот. И я также благодарен всем нашим сотрудникам, которые занимаются приездом специалистов. В частности, договаривались с Даниилом, организовывали его повестку, лекции и участвовали в круглом столе. Вот. Это и Женя, и Антон, и Артем, и Андрей. Они работают в основном на кафедре ЭЗФ и являются сотрудниками нашего Центра исследования сознания. So I'd like to
Thank you.
thank you very much, and we're looking forward to your lecture.
The floor is yours.
The floor is mine. Thank you very much, Dimitri. It's wonderful to be here. It's very exciting for me to be at this university. What a famous university it is. And it's also very exciting to visit the Moscow Center for the Study of Consciousness, which is a fantastic institution. And I wanted to thank Dimitri and Vadim in particular for making it possible, and for Anton and the others for looking after me so wonderfully while I've been here. My talk today is called The Epistemic Approach to the Mind-Body Problem. The mind-body problem is the sort of central problem in philosophy of mind, and I want to tell you about a particular approach to that problem. But I thought I would start with a quotation from Steven Pinker. You may know Steven Pinker. He's an American psychologist at Harvard. And Pinker tells us, and then there is the theory that our vertigo, when pondering the hard problem, is itself a quirk of our brains. The brain is a product of evolution, and just as animal brains have their limitations, so have ours. And so we can't grasp why neural information processing observed from the outside should give rise to subjective experience on the inside. The brain is a product of evolution. Animals have their limits. We have our limits. And we can't grasp how information observed from the outside gives rise to subjective experience from the inside. And Pinker goes on to say, that's where I place my bet. So he thinks that's the truth of the situation. Though he admits that a theory like this could be demolished when an unborn genius, a Darwin or Einstein of consciousness, comes up with a flabbergasting new idea that suddenly makes it all clear. There are some puzzling aspects of this quotation from Pinker, which we might come back to later, as to whether there could be an unborn genius of consciousness, a Darwin or Einstein of consciousness. But let's set that aside. For the moment, I just want to focus on the fact that this passage from Pinker introduces us to the idea which I call the epistemic approach to the mind-body problem. So he's describing here one version of that approach to the mind-body problem. And in fact, this approach is a very common one in the history of philosophy and science. You find it in Pinker, you find it in Thomas Nagel, you find it in Noam Chomsky, you find it in history too. You find it in, you find suggestions like this in Locke, for example, and in many, many other people. And in fact, sometimes people mention it in passing without even noticing that they've mentioned that view. I think somebody like Daniel Dennett, who's visited here, is an example of that. He mentions positions like this, but doesn't focus on it. What I want to do is to focus on that idea and to formulate it as clearly as I can. And in fact, my general aim in this part of philosophy of mind is to try to explain why this approach is the most plausible approach to the mind-body problem. So by the time this session is over, I want you to be leaving this room thinking, yep, that's the truth of the situation. So I'll be very pleased if you come towards any view like that. Okay, now I want to start with a story, and the story will, I think, convey what a lot of people feel in their bones about this view. They feel that it can't possibly be the right view. So here's the story. We'll call it the story of X. And the story of X goes like this. It's just a short story. Long ago, in a land far away, a bunch of scientists and philosophers were interested in explaining a mysterious phenomenon. We can just call it X. We don't say what it is. They were trying to explain a mysterious phenomenon. And suppose that a hero, we can call him Bill. A hero, Bill, steps forward and announces that he has a solution. And of course, everybody is very excited. And they stand around and they clap Bill and pat him on the back. Well done. What is your solution to this problem? And here's what Bill says. He says, the solution is this. I have no solution. In fact, I have no clue as to how to explain this phenomenon that we want to be explained, that we want explained. I think most of us would be disappointed by Bill's speech. What we wanted was an explanation of this thing, X. But Bill has given us no explanation. All he's done is tell us that he has no explanation. We might commend him for his honesty. We might say, okay, that's true. but it's not a solution to the problem. And I think many people, when they hear about the epistemic approach to the mind-body problem, they think, that's just like Bill. It's just like Bill. Bill has said, I don't have a solution to the problem, and he's suggested that therefore he has some solution. That's just a mistake. And the question we need to ask ourselves is whether the epistemic approach to the mind-body problem is any better than Bill's approach. And that's the question that I want to focus on in a number of different ways over the next hour or so. I want to see whether the epistemic approach, which on the face of it says we are ignorant of some feature that's relevant to this problem, whether that approach is any better than Bill's approach to X. Bill's approach to X is honest, but it's not a solution to the problem. And the question is whether the epistemic view is any better than that. Well, the first thing we could say in response to this problem about whether the epistemic approach to the mind-body problem is better than Bill, the first thing we could say is we can distinguish a number of different questions that get lumped together under the general label of the mind-body problem. People talk about the mind-body problem as if there's just one single question that demands one single answer. But that's not the situation. The situation is that when we talk about the mind-body problem, there's in fact many, many different questions that we could be focusing on. And here are two questions that we could be focusing on. We can call them Q1 and Q2. Q1 says, what exactly is the explanation of consciousness? That's one of the big questions, perhaps the biggest, in the cluster of questions that people are interested in when they become interested in the mind-body problem. Another question is a physical explanation of consciousness even possible? Is a physical explanation possible? Now notice that these two questions are distinct. They're quite different questions. The first question asks for a particular explanation of something, a bit like the question that Bill thought he was solving, an explanation for X, an explanation for consciousness. The second question, I'll see if I can get a pointer, yes. The second question asks whether a particular kind of explanation is possible, whether a certain kind of explanation is even possible before we provide it, There are also syntactic reasons to think that Q1 is distinct from Q2. Q2 is a yes-no question. The answer is either yes or no. Is a physical explanation possible? Yes or no? Q1 is a distinct question. It's asking for certain kinds of information about consciousness, certain facts about consciousness. So these are distinct questions. And the epistemic approach, as I understand it, is in the first instance, in the very first instance, it's interested in Q2. It's interested in Q2. So it's an answer to the question, is a physical explanation of consciousness even possible? That's the question that it answers. Now you might say, what about Q1? Q1, that's the question, what exactly is the explanation of consciousness? Let me set that aside for a minute, and we'll come back to that. We'll come back to Q1 as we go. So now let's think about Q2. Is a physical explanation of consciousness even possible? Well, when you ask a question like this, is a physical explanation even possible? Usually in the background of that question is an argument to the conclusion that it's not possible. Because you don't ask these kind of questions without a lot of context in the background, without assuming lots of things in the background. So what is the argument in the background of this question? In other words, to put it more simply, why shouldn't a physical explanation of consciousness be possible? Why should we think that it's not possible? That's the question that's in the background of Q2. Well, the reason for that in philosophy of mind, the main reason for that is usually called the conceivability argument. The conceivability argument is an argument that tells you that a physical explanation of consciousness is not even possible. It doesn't, it's not often presented that way. It's usually presented as an argument against what philosophers call materialism. Materialism is the thesis that consciousness is basically a physical phenomenon. And if it was a physical phenomenon, then it would have a physical explanation. The conceivability argument is an argument that materialism is false. And that's what's lying in the background of question 2. Why is a physical explanation even possible? Why not? Why is it not even possible? Answer the conceivability argument. So that's the next thing we need to look at. So let me explain how the conceivability argument works, and then I'll explain how the epistemic approach to the mind-body problem is a response to this argument. So here's the argument. It has 3 premises and a conclusion. Premise 1. It's conceivable that there is someone identical to me in all physical respects, but who differs from me in some psychological respect. I'll come back to what that premise means in a minute. Premise 2. If that's conceivable, then it's possible. Premise 3. If it's possible, then materialism is false. Conclusion, materialism is false. So there's no problem about the validity of this argument. If the premises are correct, we can move to the conclusion. The conclusion, if it was true, would establish that materialism is false, and that would establish that there's no possible physical explanation for consciousness. So the crucial question to ask is, are these premises true? Well, what do they mean? What do they mean? The first premise says that a certain situation is conceivable or imaginable. And the situation that's supposed to be conceivable or imaginable, according to this premise, is that there could be somebody, I could have a duplicate, who's physically exactly the same as me, so has all the same physical features as I do, is made up of the same stuff, has the same height and weight and so forth, all the same physical features as I do, but is different from me in a certain psychological respect. Different how? Well, one possibility is that the person could have slightly different experiences than I do. Perhaps when I see the sky that's blue, I have a certain experience, and when he sees the sky, he has a slightly different experience. Or perhaps he has no experiences at all. That would be a case in which somebody could be identical to me, but psychologically different. Different because our experiences are different. And premise 1 is saying that that is an imaginable situation. Nobody thinks that that's in fact the case. But the point is that that's a conceivable or imaginable situation. If you like, you can think of it in this way. You can think there's no contradiction in that hypothesis, that there's someone identical to me or identical to each of us who is physically exactly the same, but who is psychologically different. That's what premise 1 is saying. Premise 2 says that if that is conceivable, if that really is imaginable, then it's possible. And possibility here means that it's genuinely possible. It's a kind of what philosophers call a metaphysical possibility. It's something about what kind of claims can be true or not about the world, what the relation is between different features of the world, whether those features are related to each other in particular kinds of ways. So premise 2 moves from something that's imaginable, something that's conceivable for us, to something that is in fact possible. that's a move. Some people can deny that. And the third premise says that if it is possible that there's someone physically the same as me but psychologically different, then materialism is false. And the simplest way to see that, to see why, to see why this premise is true, is to think that materialism entails an identity of consciousness and something physical. If you thought that consciousness was identical to something physical, then it couldn't be that somebody who is physically the same as me could be different with respect to some feature of consciousness, because consciousness just is something physical. That's why the third premise is plausible. So looking again at this argument, we have a premise. The first premise tells us that something is conceivable. The second premise moves from conceivability to possibility. The third premise moves from possibility to the falsity of materialism. And the conclusion gives us that materialism is false. And if materialism is false, to go back to question 2, remember question 2 was, is a physical explanation of consciousness so much as possible? Well, if materialism is false, the answer to that is no, it's not possible. So this is the argument that tells us that a physical explanation of consciousness is not even possible. And this is the argument that we need to address if we're going to address that key question in the mind-body problem. So how do we respond to this argument? Well, this is where the epistemic approach, the approach that I'm trying to convince you of, comes in. What does the epistemic approach say? Well, the way that I understand it, the epistemic approach makes a certain hypothesis about our epistemic situation. In other words, what it is that we know, what the world is like around us, and how much of that world do we know. We certainly know some things about the world around us. That's taken for granted in this kind of discussion. But what the ignorance hypothesis says is it says that there are physical respects which meet two conditions. First, there are physical respects of which we are ignorant. That means there are physical respects that we don't know about. And second, which are relevant to consciousness. So that this is a hypothesis about our epistemic position. It might be true, it might be false, but it certainly could be true. There's no reason to believe that it isn't true. So what that hypothesis says is it says there are physical respects of which we are ignorant, which are relevant to consciousness. Now, when you first hear about this hypothesis, sometimes people ask, well, what are these respects? What are these respects of which you're ignorant, which are relevant to consciousness? And of course, if you ask that question, while that's a natural question, it's a question which hasn't really absorbed this hypothesis, because it's a feature of this hypothesis that these are respects of which we are ignorant. So we can't say what they are. The hypothesis says that there are such respects, but of course it doesn't tell us what they are. It can't do that. It just says that there are some and they are relevant to consciousness. So it says basically we are missing something in our current situation. That's what the ignorance hypothesis says. And that's really what an epistemic approach to the mind-body problem says. That's the core of it. It's epistemic because it has to do with our ignorance, what we are ignorant of. And it's relevant to consciousness. That's why it's relevant to the mind-body problem. So that's the key hypothesis about our epistemic situation. Okay, now, what is the connection between this hypothesis and the reasoning I just mentioned, the conceivability argument? Well, here's a way that we can think about it. Actually, the ignorance hypothesis will defeat the conceivability argument. It will show conclusively that that argument is not a persuasive argument. To put it a different way, if the ignorance hypothesis is true, this argument is not a persuasive argument. Why not? Well, let's look again at the first premise of the argument. It's conceivable that there is someone identical to me in all physical respects, but different in some psychological respect. Let's focus on this phrase, in all physical respects. So what we're imagining is somebody identical to me in every physical respect, but different in some psychological respect. Now, this phrase can be interpreted in a number of different ways. What do we mean by saying all physical respects? Well, if the ignorance hypothesis is true, this phrase can be interpreted in two ways, and in fact, only in two ways. First, we could interpret it so that this phrase, all physical respects, is interpreted very broadly to include those respects of which we are ignorant, of which the ignorance hypothesis says that we are ignorant. We could interpret it that way. Or the other possibility is we could interpret it so that all physical respects is interpreted narrowly so that it doesn't include those features. Either all physical respects includes the features of which we're ignorant, or it doesn't include those features. Those are the only two possibilities, logically speaking, in the situation. If the ignorance hypothesis is correct, then either we include these physical respects here in this phrase, or we don't. And the point is that either way, this argument fails. Either way, this argument fails. First of all, suppose that the physical respects are included in here. Then the premise says it's conceivable that there's someone identical to me in all physical respects, including ones I don't know about, but such that that person is different from me psychologically. Now that is not a claim that one can make, and the reason is that conceivability has a certain kind of epistemic demand on us. Conceiving is often contrasted with supposing. In philosophy, we often suppose things for a reductio ad absurdum argument. One can suppose anything. One can suppose that 2 + 2 = 5. One can suppose that P and not P. One can suppose that there is someone identical to me in all physical respects, but different from me in some psychological respect. When you mount the conceivability argument, when you put that argument forward, conceivability cannot mean supposing. And the reason is that supposing is not a guide to possibility. The fact that you can suppose that P is true gives you no reason to believe that P is possible. After all, as I just said, you can suppose that 2 + 2 = 5, and it's obviously not possible that 2 + 2 = 5. So the notion of conceiving in the argument here requires you to know what features it is that you're talking about. And that means that when you include in this phrase all physical respects, those features that we do not know about, according to the hypothesis, this is not an assertable premise. This premise isn't true. And if it's not true, the argument fails. So, if you interpret this phrase in a very broad way, such that it includes these features, then the premise fails. Suppose we interpret it in the narrow way that I mentioned. Suppose we interpret it so that all physical respects is understood to not include those features. That's the other possibility that was logically left open. Well, in that case, we might agree that the first premise is true, but now the reasoning will not allow us to conclude that materialism is false. And the reason it won't allow us to conclude that is because all it will tell us is that psychological facts about consciousness, come apart from some of the physical truths, not all of the physical truths. And if it only comes apart from some of the physical truths, nothing about materialism follows. Obviously, psychological facts can come apart from some of the physical truths. The crucial question for materialism is whether they come apart from all of them. So, either way, if the ignorance hypothesis is true, and after all, there's no reason to believe that it isn't true, then the underlying phrase here can be interpreted in two ways, and either way, this argument fails. So the ignorance hypothesis undermines the conceivability argument. Now, how does this view differ from alternative approaches to the conceivability argument? Well, there are three main alternatives that we can consider. The first option is the dualist option. The dualist in philosophy of mind is a person who accepts the conceivability argument. They agree that that argument is a persuasive argument, and then postulates that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, perhaps like space or time, something like that. A basic feature of reality, a fundamental feature. Then there's a position which these days is often called illusionism. Illusionism says that the argument is successful if you assume that consciousness exists. If you assume that consciousness exists, then the conceivability argument is a successful argument. It's just that illusionism goes on to say that consciousness is an illusion. It doesn't exist. So that's why the argument fails. So in a certain sense, both dualism and illusionism accept the conceivability argument. It's just that illusionism thinks that consciousness doesn't exist in the first place. And then there's a position which I usually call standard materialism. Standard materialism denies that the argument is sound. Of course they do, because the argument is an argument to the falsity of materialism. So obviously you must deny that the argument is sound if you're a standard materialist. So what's the difference between standard materialism and the position which I'm describing? What's the difference? Well, the difference is this. The standard materialist is a person who doesn't accept that ignorance hypothesis that I mentioned, or at any rate does not accept that the ignorance hypothesis is relevant to the philosophical issues. The standard materialist tries to deal with this argument not by assuming that we're ignorant, but by trying to find out, trying to point to other failures of the argument. And admittedly, when you first look at this argument, there are lots of things, lots of questions that you might ask. Some of you may have asked those questions yourselves when I put up the conceivability argument. You might have thought, well, what is this notion of conceiving? And why does it follow from the fact that you can conceive something to the fact that it's possible? And moreover, if it's possible, what does that tell us about the actual world? And materialism is, after all, a thesis about the actual world. So there are lots of different ways of dealing with this. Perhaps the most famous one is sometimes called the phenomenal concept strategy. The phenomenal concept strategy tries to say that there are certain features in how we think about consciousness and how we think about the physical, which generates, which shows the mistake in that argument. Now, there are lots of things to say about all of these proposals about how to deal with the conceivability argument within the framework of standard materialism. Let me just say that I think that none of those will work. In that sense, I agree with the illusionist and I agree with the dualist, who likewise think that nothing of that sort can work. But it doesn't follow from that that you must endorse dualism or you must endorse illusionism, because that still leaves us with the possibility of what you might call a non-standard materialist view. A non-standard materialist view, for these purposes, is just a kind of materialism that accepts that there are features of the physical world that are relevant to consciousness of which we are ignorant. I'm going to come back to this question about what's standard materialism and why that's so important. Let me ask this question first. You might say, is the non-standard materialist really a kind of materialism? Is it really a kind of materialism? Because it doesn't tell us what the nature of matter is. Well, I think that there's a difference between materialism as it's used in the philosophy of mind. Sometimes we can draw a distinction between something in a loose and popular sense and something in a strict and philosophical sense. This is a distinction that people use a lot when they talk about identity. There's identity in the loose and popular sense, and there's identity in the strict and philosophical sense. And likewise, we could say there's materialism in the loose and popular sense, and there's materialism in the strict and philosophical sense. In the loose and popular sense, materialism is the view that consciousness, if it exists, is not a fundamental element of nature. It's just that thesis, that consciousness isn't fundamental, which is what a dualist believes. In the strict and philosophical sense, materialism is a much more ambitious thesis. It doesn't just say that consciousness is not fundamental. It says it makes a particular proposal about particular physical theories and particular theories about the nature of matter. And in the history of the subject, that's exactly what materialism was. It formulated particular theories about matter and then took those theories to be, if you like, universal theories, theories about the basic nature of reality. Now, I think that non-standard materialism, NSM, is a materialist position only in the first sense, not in the second. So it's only a materialism in the kind of loose sense, not in the strict sense. But on the other hand, many positions in philosophy these days that are called materialism are likewise materialism only in that first sense, not in the strict sense. Because many theories do not, in fact, articulate particular theories of matter and tie themselves to that. Okay, so now I've told you a little bit about the epistemic approach and how it works, how it answers this conceivability argument. It answers the conceivability argument by focusing on the first premise of that argument, the premise that says it's conceivable that there's somebody identical to me in all physical respects and different from me in a certain psychological respect. And it focuses on the notion of all physical respects, on that crucial phrase, and it says that crucial phrase can be understood in one of two ways, and either way the argument fails. But there are lots of different versions of the epistemic approach, so let me just mention three of them before moving on to some objections. So there's really three. The first is what is sometimes called the Mysterian version of this approach. And that says not only are we ignorant of certain features that are relevant to consciousness, so not only is the ignorance hypothesis true, but it's biologically impossible for us to overcome that ignorance. It's biologically impossible for human beings to come to know about those features. That, in fact, is the notion that Pinker was talking about in the passage that I began with. He had in mind the philosopher Colin McGinn. He had McGinn in mind, and McGinn is associated with this idea that there's a Mysterian version of the epistemic view. That's one possible view. Another possible view, which is actually very prominent in contemporary philosophy of mind, I'll call it the Russellian version. That is associated with positions that are sometimes called Russellian monism, or in some versions, certain kinds of panpsychist views are of this sort. And this view says that not only is it the case that there are features of matter that are relevant to consciousness of which we are ignorant, but these are features which are the so-called intrinsic features of matter. The reason that this is called Russellian is because it's associated with a proposal of Bertrand Russell's from the 1920s. Russell has a book called The Analysis of Matter, and in that book he defends a kind of structuralism according to which physics tells us only about structural features of matter, but there are also non-structural or intrinsic features of matter. And a Russellian version of the epistemic approach says that the features that we've been talking about, the features that are mentioned in the ignorance hypothesis, are nothing else than those intrinsic features of matter. That's the Russellian version of this view. There's also a much more minimal version which doesn't really make any of these further claims. It doesn't make the claim that it's completely impossible for human beings to know about these things, or that they are the intrinsic features of matter that emerge in Russell's specific epistemology. And we can capture this by using some sort of debauched version of Wittgenstein. Whereof one is ignorant, thereof one should mostly be silent. Basically, if there are these features of which we're ignorant, then we shouldn't go on to theorize about them too much, which is what, roughly speaking, the Mysterian version and the Russellian version of this view do. And you don't need to. So notice that I've been interested in the question of how to defeat the conceivability argument using these ideas. In order to do that, you don't need to say anything dramatic in the way that the Mysterian version does or the Russellian version. You just need the minimal version. And that's the only one today that I'm going to be recommending. So that's the epistemic approach. But now let me turn to two objections, which some of you may have already thought about. And the first objection I'll call the relevance objection. That's the first objection to this view. And the relevance objection goes like this. It says, the ignorance hypothesis is only half right. Yes, there are features of which we are ignorant. Who would deny that? But they're not relevant to consciousness or to the conceivability argument. They're not relevant. It's wrong to assume that they're relevant. Well, what can we say against the relevance objection? Well, the first response I want to say, the first reply I would give to this objection is as follows. I think as an empirical matter, it's very hard to believe that we are not ignorant with respect to consciousness. Remember, the quotation I began with is from Steven Pinker, who thinks that some position in this vein is right. In fact, he thinks that a position that's even stronger than the one that I've been describing is right. These are scientific people. It seems extreme to say that all of the facts relevant to consciousness are known. That's the thing that the ignorance hypothesis is denying. So that's the first reply I would give to the relevance objection. The second reply I would give is to remind everybody that the ignorance in question can be very, very abstract. It can not only be that we don't know certain features of the world, certain properties, we may also not know certain properties of those properties. That's a somewhat abstract kind of ignorance. It focuses only on whether particular properties, how certain properties, how they come together and form much more complex systems. We could be ignorant of that in that sort of way as well. And that makes it much more plausible that we are ignorant in this way because it's much more abstract. And then finally, we need to bear in mind that there are historical precedents for our current situation. Of course, we can't point to the features that we're ignorant of according to the ignorance hypothesis. That goes without saying. But what we can do is point out that we've been in a very similar situation intellectually that we currently are in. And if that is true, then it's reasonable to think that there are features of which we're ignorant. And we know that this is the case, so that the classic formulation of the mind-body problem, the Cartesian formulation, the one offered by Descartes, that formulation was based on a false theory of matter. Descartes thought that matter was just extension in space. And that was crucial to the way in which he set up the problem. And so in a certain sense, he was in fact ignorant of certain features of matter. So there's no particular reason to think that our current situation is not similar to his in that respect. So that's my reply to the relevance objection. I'll come back to that objection in a minute. But let me turn to another objection. And this I'll call the no-answer objection. The no-answer objection. The no-answer objection says this. It says, the epistemic approach doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem. We want an explanation of consciousness. And you're not offering one. That's not what the epistemic approach offers. In other words, it says, when all is said and done, you're just in the position of Bill. Bill was the hero of the story of X, who didn't offer the explanation. And maybe we're just in that situation. That's what the no-answer objection says. Here's another way to put it. Remember before I said, when we talk about the mind-body problem, we really are talking about lots and lots of different questions. And I distinguished two in particular, namely, what exactly is the explanation of consciousness? And is a physical explanation even possible? And I focused on Q2, the second question. We've been talking about that. But you might say, well, what about Q1? Isn't that the one that we've been interested in all along? That's the question that we need an answer to if you're going to answer the mind-body problem. And that question you haven't answered. In fact, you've set it aside. So that's the no answer objection. Now, I think that when we think about this question, we need to focus on what an explanation of consciousness might be. What is Q1 asking of us? What is it that people are looking for when they ask for an explanation of consciousness? And I think there are really two possibilities here. There are two importantly different possibilities. The first possibility is that people might want what I'll call total information about how the physical facts generate consciousness. Remember, if we're endorsing materialism of any kind at all, then what we're thinking is that there are physical facts of the world, and those physical facts generate consciousness. Consciousness is grounded in those physical facts. That is just the system of nature as we understand it. And one thing we could ask when we ask for an explanation of consciousness is total information about that system. You might ask, for example, how exactly the basic elements of nature come together to make a being that is conscious. That would be to ask for total information about how physical facts generate consciousness. You could also ask for something that is often confused with total information, and that's something less, and I'll call it partial information about a totality. There is the total system of nature, and consciousness has a place within that total system. And if materialism is true, that total system is a materialist system. That means that there are basic physical facts which generate consciousness. And what we might want is information about that total system. So we need to draw a distinction between total information and information about a totality, information about everything. Now, those are two things that you could be looking for when you ask for an explanation of consciousness. Now, suppose that we understand Q1, the question, what is the explanation of consciousness, as a demand for total information. Suppose we understand it that way. Then I think it's true that the epistemic approach doesn't answer that question. It doesn't tell you what exactly the physical facts are and how exactly they come together to produce consciousness. It doesn't tell you that. But on the other hand, I think that approach is unreasonable, because to ask that would be to give a complete theory of nature. Of course, we're not in any position at the moment to give such a theory. That would be ridiculous to think that we're in that kind of situation. So we shouldn't demand total information in that sense. In fact, the epistemic approach doesn't just not provide that information. It says that, as a matter of fact, we are not in any position to provide that information now. It asserts, on the contrary, that we cannot do that. We can't give total information. But I think that the demand for total information is an implausible one. What about if the demand is for information about the total system? Not total information, but just information about the total system. Suppose we understand that as what the explanation is offering. Then the epistemic approach does provide it, because it tells us something important about the total system of nature. It tells us, for example, that consciousness isn't a kind of break in that system of nature. It's not like that. All it says is that if we regard ourselves as ignorant of certain features of the world, then we can assume that the system is as the materialist says. That's one reason why this approach can provide partial information about the totality. It doesn't, of course, provide total information, but I think that's an unreasonable demand. Moreover, there's another reason, and that is that there are many, many other features, many, many other questions that are included in the cluster that the mind-body problem is. And here are some of them. Question 1 and question 2 we've looked at already. Question 1 says, what exactly is the explanation? Question 2 is a physical explanation even possible? Question 3 is, what is it that makes a mental state conscious? Suppose we focus on particular psychological features. Why are some conscious and why are others not conscious? Question 4 says, are you always aware of your conscious states? Sometimes people think that a conscious state is one of which you are conscious. We can answer that question. Question 5 is, what is the psychological or rational role of conscious states? How do they interact with other kinds of psychological features? How do they make certain beliefs reasonable or unreasonable? That's the rational role. And then finally, what neural or computational structures are associated with conscious states? There's nothing in the epistemic approach that says that we cannot make progress on all of these questions and provide answers to them. Because these questions, especially 3, 4, 5, and 6, those questions can be discussed and we can formulate answers to them even in the absence of having total information about the way in which the physical facts come together to yield conscious facts. So I think that we can provide answers in principle to all of these questions completely consistently with the epistemic approach. Okay, so now you might ask this question at this point. What is going on exactly? And the reason I ask that question is this. We've looked at 2 objections, the relevance objection and the no answer objection. And both of those objections seem, on their own terms, relatively easily answerable, I think. But I think that lying behind them is a highly influential set of expectations about what philosophy is and how what an answer to the mind-body problem should look like. And I want to finish by looking briefly at those assumptions in the background and saying something about them. So I think there are really 2 assumptions in the background of these objections. The first is that there are these 2 pictures about how to do philosophy that are extremely common. I'll call them the Canopian picture and the Quinean picture. The Canopian picture is named for Rudolf Carnap. Carnap's way of doing philosophy, roughly speaking, was to say that there is a base language, a language which by itself does not raise any epistemological or metaphysical questions. We can have statements in that base language, and that in a certain sense we know that language a priori, or we can know it independently of inquiry into the nature of the world. And what philosophy does is it explains other statements in terms of the base language. So you start off with a base language, and then a contribution to a philosophical problem will be an account of how certain other statements are related to that base language. That's the Carnapian picture. The other picture is the Quinean picture, named for Quine. And what Quine said is that it's not that we have a set of statements formulated in a base language, but what we do have is a set of facts given to us by contemporary science. Quine thinks that there's a set of facts given to us by contemporary science, and what philosophy does is it really explains other facts in terms of that set of base facts. The set of facts given to us by contemporary science from the Quinean point of view don't themselves raise any philosophical questions, according to Quine, just like the set of statements in the base language for Carnap don't raise any philosophical questions. Now, these are very big traditions in philosophy about how to think about philosophical questions. They sort of tell you about how to structure certain kinds of questions. And I say they're both rationalist because in a certain sense, both of them have this image that all the facts that are relevant to these questions are known to us. On the Quinean picture, we have to theorize within a set of facts given to us by contemporary science, which are presumably known to us. And on the Canopian picture, we theorize within a base language, which we know about a priori. Now, if you hold these pictures of philosophy, you're very likely to be dissatisfied with the epistemic approach as I've been describing it. And that's because the epistemic approach departs from these traditions. It violates the expectations of these traditions. And the first reason is that it doesn't assume that all of the relevant facts are in. Both the Quinean position and the Canopian position assume that all of the relevant facts are in, pretty much, when we address a philosophical question. On the Quinean picture, we assume that there's a set of facts given to us by contemporary science, and we explain other things in terms of that. That's a way of making the assumption that all of the relevant facts are in. And on the Canopian picture, it's even more extreme, because you begin with a certain kind of base language which would be able to formulate all the relevant types of facts that we're interested in. So it doesn't assume that, and that's what I think is lying behind the relevance objection. Remember, that objection said, yeah, maybe we're ignorant in a certain sense, but none of them are going to be relevant to this sort of problem. And that's because I think when people say that, they're thinking that the problem is to be understood roughly in the Canopian or the Quinean way. And if you understand it that way, then all the relevant facts are in. That's true. Likewise, it doesn't explain consciousness in either the Canopian or the Quinean sense. It doesn't explain it in the Canopian sense because it doesn't explain facts about consciousness in terms of a base language, and it doesn't explain it in the Quinean sense because it doesn't explain it in terms of a bunch of facts given to us by contemporary science. In fact, the whole point is to deny that. So that's what's lying behind, I think, the relevance objection and the no answer objection. But I think that one should basically reject this. There's no reason to think that we should do philosophy in that way, that we should adopt either the Quinean picture or the Canopian picture. And there's another picture which I could describe, which is really, I'll call it the Lewisian picture, in honor of David Lewis. Lewis's view about explanation, I think, would say something like this about the mind-body problem. He would say that facts about consciousness stand at the apex of a big and vast, complicated system of facts. And that what we want to do in philosophy is to illuminate that system. Lewis himself didn't talk about this in a synchronic way. He discussed this issue in a diachronic way. So, for example, he said on questions of explanation, when you focus on a particular, say, historical event, let's say the fall of Rome, we can think about that event as standing at the terminus of a huge system of events going all the way back to the beginning of time. And when you provide an explanation of the fall of Rome, what you do is you illuminate certain features of that structure. Nobody would think, from Lewis's point of view, that you have to illuminate the entire structure. That would be the mistake of wanting total information. What you want instead is partial information about the total system. And what I'm suggesting here is that we can think about the mind-body problem and explaining consciousness in the same kind of Lewis-inspired way. We can think about conscious systems, like the ones that are instantiated in this room, in our own heads, as standing at the apex of an enormous system of facts leading all the way down to the basic facts of nature. And when we want an explanation of those facts, what we should be looking for is information that illuminates part of that total system. Of course, we shouldn't be looking for information that tells you absolutely everything about that system. That's not anything that's a reasonable demand. Okay, so let me draw some conclusions and finish, and also answer any questions that you have for me. So the first conclusion is this. The epistemic approach, I think, answers the conceivability and other arguments. I say and other arguments because the conceivability argument, as we talked about it today, is really emblematic of a whole family of arguments. But I think that the answer that I've been describing about that argument would apply to those other arguments as well. Secondly, the second conclusion is that I think this answer is preferable to other answers. It's certainly preferable, I think, to the dualist answer and to the illusionist answer, though I haven't really explained why. We can do that if you like. And I also say that it's preferable to the answers provided by the non-standard materialist. The non-standard materialist, again, is somebody, sorry, the standard materialist, I'm sorry. The standard materialist is somebody who tries to answer the argument without making that ignorance hypothesis. But that view, I think, runs into very serious problems. The third conclusion is that the answer offered by the epistemic approach departs from some very well-entrenched views about how to do philosophy, how to answer a philosophical question. And in particular, it departs from that Canopian picture and the Quinean picture that I mentioned in favor of a much different sort of picture. But my final conclusion is I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So that's all I have to say for today. So thank you. I can take some questions if you would like, if anyone has any or comments.
Большое еще раз. Спасибо, давайте скажем нашему переводчику, коллеге Андрею Веретенникову.
Давайте, а кто будет модерировать? I have a short question. Thank you for a brilliant lecture. I see a kind of problem in the ignorance hypothesis. You talk about unknown properties, but it seems that you should talk about unknown properties, which are principally different from the known physical properties.
Right.
Sure, you see why. But couldn't this addition make the hypothesis less reasonable?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So I can, if I go back to this, just the formulation of the hypothesis. Yes, so your point is, what we really should be talking about is that there's a certain kind of physical respect of which we're ignorant, but is also different in kind, right, from any feature that we know about today. I absolutely agree. So that's true. So that it has to have that strength. If it doesn't have that strength,
but it's different hypothesis then. Maybe it's not so reasonable to suppose that there are such properties.
Well, that's an interesting question. So why do you think that wouldn't be that reasonable? I agree. So first of all, I agree with you completely that that's how the hypothesis has to be formulated. Technically speaking, that's true. But why do you say that wouldn't be as reasonable? Because that would just be. It depends on how to understand the notion of a type of property.
More concrete hypothesis. It's simply because of that. It's not so reasonable.
Yeah, certainly, you're absolutely right. It's a much more, you're right that I've been talking in a kind of soothing way where it makes it seem as if everyone can agree with this. But it's true that in order to believe it, you must believe that there's a type of physical truth that's different. But notice that many of the points that I mentioned remain the case. When I discussed the relevance objection, for example, that objection says, well, we're not ignorant of any, in your way of formulating it would be that we're not ignorant of any type of truth. But I think that the same sort of thing applies. We still have historical precedent. We still have the point that we could be talking about properties of properties. And we still have the point that I think that's what the claims of these people are. You're absolutely right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. So was a little bit surprised when you say that illusionism accepts the argument, the conceivability argument, given that the consciousness exists. By consciousness, you mean psychological features.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that what illusionists deny is that qualia so illusionists deny that qualia are consistent, logical, or conceivable.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure that a lot of illusionists will accept your expression of illusionism. And then, if you can also specify what really do you mean by consciousness? Do you mean qualia? And do you believe in qualia, the existence of qualia, and that it's a datum that we need to take into account seriously, and that it's ineffable, incorrigible, etc., etc.?
Yes, terrific question. So you might say an illusionist illusionists might not think that consciousness is an illusion. They might not want to say that. They only want to say that consciousness understood in a particular way is an illusion. For example, because it's ineffable or can't be expressed or something. That's right. What I think is that illusionism, there's a feature of consciousness that is non-negotiable for the illusionist, and that is whatever the feature is that generates the conceivability argument, whatever the notion of consciousness is that's at issue in that argument, that's the notion that has to be an illusion, because otherwise they don't have any answer to that conceivability argument, right? And what I think is that the notion of consciousness that is required in that argument is a very minimal one. I don't think you need to think about it as having lots of properties like ineffability, intrinsicness, any of those features. Yeah, I don't think you need any of those features. I think all you need is a very minimal notion. That I can imagine someone who is physically identical to me, but for whom, for example, the taste of coffee is ever so slightly different from the taste of mine. That's sufficient. And that doesn't involve ineffability or intrinsicness or anything. I think when people think about these issues, what they often do is they often assume that there's some very sophisticated notion of consciousness at issue in these arguments. And then once they've done that, they feel okay denying its existence because they're not denying anything obvious. But I think that's a mistake. I think that the notion of consciousness that's at issue in these arguments is a very minimal one. It doesn't require any of those further notions. And so actually, that's the notion of consciousness that I had in mind throughout. And I think that illusionism, if it's going to be an interesting doctrine, has to be the doctrine that is an illusion. It's a bit like, when illusionists, they talk sometimes about weak versus strong illusionism. Weak illusionism, everybody's a weak illusionist. The crucial question is whether you're a strong illusionist, and a strong illusionist is somebody who thinks that whatever it is that generates the conceivability argument, whatever psychological feature it is, that feature doesn't exist, and therefore it's an illusion. That it's an illusion that it exists, and that I think isn't a sustainable position for that. Yeah.
I very much like your reply to the conceivability argument. It's just so beautiful. I'm not sure why should we be so optimistic and say that the aspects we are ignorant about are physical. Why isn't it some different psychological, I don't know, immaterial? And why is this point of view preferable to other answers? I'm sure you're ready to answer that.
Why is it preferable to other answers? You mean about whether the features are physical or not? Yes. Yeah. So you could say you could imagine. Let's see. This hypothesis says there are physical features of which we are ignorant, but which are relevant to consciousness. You could say there are also non-physical features of which we are ignorant and which are relevant to consciousness. You could imagine a hypothesis like that, And maybe that's true. But of course, if that was the hypothesis, it wouldn't interact with the conceivability argument in the way that I want.
Yes, but why don't we say they are both physical and immaterial?
You mean the features of which we're ignorant? Yes, so I think this has to do with the question of how to use the word physical. So the question is, suppose there are features of which we're ignorant, which are relevant to consciousness. Now, if we call them physical, can we also call them something else? Are they some other feature? Or what is it that justifies us in calling them physical? And I think that's actually rather difficult, because sometimes people might use the word physical so that it's limited to, for example, known physical theories, in which case these features wouldn't count as physical. But sometimes what I mean here is something relatively weak, something like respects or properties that are do not themselves involve consciousness. That's all I have in mind. Now, I think that that's a preferable view than an alternative view, mainly for the reasons I mentioned. One is, unless you said that, it wouldn't interact with the conceivability argument. But secondly, if you said that there were respects which involved consciousness of which we're ignorant, but which are relevant to consciousness, then you'd end up with a rather different position. You might end up with a kind of panpsychist position, for example. And I think that I haven't discussed that today, but I think that panpsychism is, I think it's an amazing hypothesis, but I think it runs into many, many, many problems, so I wouldn't want to go in that direction.
We can left some question for the next session, of course.
Okay, sure.
Precisely.
Yes.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your brilliant lecture.
Thank you.
If I understood you correctly, the novelty of your epistemic approach is that you have introduced ignorance into it.
Yes.
And as far as ignorance is concerned, I would suggest some, perhaps, that you can go further on and include in your ignorance the ignorance of other horizons of meanings of basic notions.
Yes.
I mean, all your constructure, all your system is based on the Western philosophical tradition, on the Western horizon of meanings, but you completely left aside the other traditions of understanding consciousness.
True.
I mean, Buddhist
Yes.
or Indian.
Yes.
And in my opinion, you would find many points which would enlarge your Western
Yes.
understanding.
Yes.
So your ignorance must be enriched by the awareness of this fact.
You're right. I agree with you. You're absolutely right. In this particular talk, I'm speaking in a kind of uniquely Western way, and you're absolutely right that there are lots of traditions of philosophy. For these particular kind of questions, actually, I haven't, so far as I know, I haven't seen that much in the Buddhist tradition that's relevant. But for remember, right at the end, I said there's lots of different questions. Let's see, this one. So if these questions, what is it that makes a mental state conscious, or are you always aware? Those issues are very richly discussed, and that's something that we have at the university where I'm from in Australia. We have had conferences on precisely those issues, trying to bring together Eastern traditions and Western traditions. But it's, yeah, no, it's you don't do that. Well, we don't do it very much either, but we've tried to do it, and it's very difficult. I mean, one problem is that we've had, experts in Buddhist philosophy, and if you're not an expert in Buddhist philosophy, you think everybody in Buddhist philosophy holds one particular view. Like, take this view. Often people say, in Buddhist philosophy, it's assumed that you're always aware of your conscious states. And that turns out not to be true. There's these factions. Some say yes and others say no, and they're arguing back and forth. So I agree with you. That's a big issue which I haven't dealt with at all today.
Your ignorance must be enriched by the fact that even in Buddhist tradition,
Yeah.
there are so many points of
Yes.
view on the same.
Yes, I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree.
Thank you so much for the question. We have a summer school on Buddhist tradition.
All right.
So
Terrific.
And finally, even in the frame of your lecture, ignorance works as something productive and
Yes.
really creative. So we have another question.
I've already got the answer to my question.
Okay. All right.
Another question?
What would you say about net blocks?
But take care, the interpreter has to
Okay.
hear you.
Do you hear me?
Thank you.
What would you say about net blocks conception that it's not always about the missing facts or unknown facts, but sometimes it's a matter of missing conceptual schemes.
Yeah.
Like ancient Greeks, they generally did know all the needed facts, but they didn't have conceptual schemes to understand that, well, light and sound are,
Yeah.
well, of the same nature. So
Yes.
maybe we don't have some ways, we are still missing some conceptual schemes
Yes.
that would promote our understanding of consciousness.
Yes. So that's an interesting alternative view. That's I mentioned this briefly. Let's see. Here where I talk about this thing, which in my part of philosophy is called the phenomenal concept strategy. It's the idea that you have these different concepts, which is a bit related to your idea about different conceptual schemes, and that's different from not being not ignorant of some relevant feature, but just having two different ways of thinking about the issue, and that might be a way of solving the problem. I think, and you're right, Ned says that basically. I think it's kind of magic, to be honest, because the idea that you have these concepts which are very different but apply to the same thing without there being two features of the world that are sort of that the concepts are latching onto. I don't understand what the theory of meaning is that people like Ned Block have in mind when they say that kind of thing. So that's roughly speaking my response to it. Sometimes when you hear the kinds of points that you mentioned, well, you say, well, there are different conceptual schemes. That might actually be the same as the proposal that I had in mind. But if it's literally a notion of what the concepts are, distinct from the properties, then I get a bit worried that it actually makes sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. More questions?
I have one question. Thank you for your lecture. I like your notion of ignorance because sure we have no possibility to understand the world in ultimate sense. But nevertheless, what do you think about mental causality? Does consciousness participate in the process of mental causality or not? Is consciousness something different from narrow interactions? Or you ignore it and just some kind of narrow interactions we do not know about?
Right, so I think that it's got to be the case that consciousness participates in mental causation. It has to be that that if you're conscious, that makes you do something, or conscious states have a causal role. And so I don't think that I don't think that anything in the position I outlined would undermine that, and I'd be very disappointed if it did. And the reason is, but what it does tell you is something like, well, if we're ignorant of a certain feature of the physical world that yields consciousness, then we're probably ignorant of a certain feature of the physical world that yields the effects of consciousness too. And so that we can't tell a full causal story in the way that we might think that we could tell one.
But now, maybe in the future.
Maybe, yeah, exactly. So that, who knows? Who knows about the future? I'm talking about what to believe now, not what's true in the future. Yeah.
So about the future, we have 2 days to prepare more questions.
Okay.
After the next lecture. So we'll end today.
When will be the next lecture?
Thursday. The same time, the same place. So you are welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your questions. Thank you.